Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. You know we love getting your requests, and you guys have been sending in a ton about cults lately, and not just general stuff. You've been digging deep, sending in academic papers and news articles, even legal documents and religious texts. We even saw some Reddit threads in there. Looks like you guys are ready to go deep on this one. So today we are talking about cults, and we're going to try to answer your questions like, what actually makes a group a cult? And we're also taking a close look at one specific group a lot of you asked about, the Iglesia Ni Cristo. We'll dive into their beliefs and practices, even some of those more controversial aspects. To help us break it all down, I'm joined by our expert in religious studies and social movements. Welcome. I got to admit, before we got started with all this, I kind of thought I knew what a cult was. Pretty straightforward. But the more we dug into all this stuff, the more I realized...
Oh, it's complicated.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Cult is one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot. But when you actually try to define it, it's really slippery. And it definitely comes loaded with some negative baggage. There's no, one-size-fits-all checklist. It's more about recognizing patterns and tendencies.
Okay, so no easy checklist. So how do we even begin to figure out what makes a group a cult? Where do we even start?
Well, one of the first things researchers often point to is a charismatic leader. Someone who's seen as having, special knowledge or a direct line to a higher power.
Okay, so that makes sense.
Right.
A powerful, magnetic personality in charge. What else?
Another big one is a focus on isolation and control. These groups often try to limit members' contact with the outside world, whether it's family or friends, or even information that challenges their beliefs.
So they're kind of creating their own reality, shutting out anything that might contradict them. Which I guess makes sense. If you want to control people, you got to control the information they're getting right.
Exactly. And to maintain that control, you often see deception and manipulation. Groups might use misleading recruitment tactics, promising enlightenment or transformation.
Oh yeah, and even financial success. Some of these sources even mentioned love bombing, where they shower new recruits with attention and affection. Sounds nice on the surface, but it's all very calculated, right?
It is. It plays on that human need to feel accepted. It makes it much harder for people to walk away even when things get weird.
Yeah, because they feel like they owe the group something. And it all seems to come back to power. The power of the leader over the followers. The power of the group over the individual. And I guess power can be really seductive, both for the people who have it and the people who are subject to it.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another common characteristic, exploitation. It can be financial, emotional, or even physical.
So like being pressured to donate money or work long hours without pay.
Yeah.
And we even saw cases where people were abused.
Right, and it's almost like a betrayal.
Because these are the people who are supposed to be offering you salvation or enlightenment. But instead, they're exploiting you.
Yeah, and to justify their actions, a lot of these groups will cultivate an us versus them mentality.
So they're the chosen ones. Everyone else is wrong.
Right, they create this sense of superiority, reinforcing the idea that the group is the only true path.
So we've got a powerful leader, a closed-off system, manipulation and exploitation, and this constant message that they're the only ones who have it right. It's kind of a scary picture.
It can be, but it's important to remember these are tendencies, not hard and fast rules. Just because a group has some of these characteristics doesn't automatically make them a cult.
Right. It's about looking at the whole picture,
Yeah.
the degree and the context. So let's talk about a specific group, the Iglesia Ni Cristo, or INC. You sent us a lot of interesting material on them.
Yeah, the INC is a fascinating case. They're a relatively new Christian denomination, founded in the Philippines in 1914 by Felix Manalo.
And one of the first things that jumped out at me from their own materials is the belief that they are the only true church established by Jesus Christ and the only path to salvation. That's a pretty big claim.
It is. And it's tied to their belief that Felix Manalo was God's last messenger, a prophet chosen to restore the true church.
So that puts Manalo in a pretty powerful position. His word is law, basically.
Pretty much. His teachings and interpretations of the Bible are seen as absolute truth.
So there's this big emphasis on obedience to the church leadership, which kind of lines up with some of those cult characteristics we were talking about. What about people who disagree with their teachings or decide to leave the INC?
That's considered a very serious thing. They believe that leaving the INC is rejecting God's true church and forfeiting your salvation.
So there's a lot of pressure to stay.
There is. And we've seen reports of former members facing some pretty intense backlash.
Like what?
Social ostracism, pressure from family members who are still in the church, even threats and harassment.
That's heavy. It makes it really hard to leave. And speaking of pressure, one of the most controversial things about the INC is their practice of block voting, right?
Right, block voting is a core part of their political strategy. The church leadership tells members who to vote for.
And they say it's about unity and obedience to God's will.
Right, as interpreted by the church, of course.
And this has made them a pretty major force in Philippine politics, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Politicians see their endorsement as a game changer
For sure.
because they can deliver a huge block of votes,
Exactly. And that's raised concerns about potential for corruption.
like quid pro quo arrangements, favors in exchange for endorsements.
Exactly.
So on the one hand, you've got this religious group that's all about unity and obedience, which on its own isn't necessarily bad. But then you add this political layer, and suddenly that unity is being used for political influence. It gets really blurry.
It does.
Where does religious practice end and political strategy begin?
Right. And it's fueled a lot of debate in the Philippines about the separation of church and state.
Because critics argue that this kind of block voting violates individual freedom of conscience.
Exactly.
And it undermines democratic principles. Because it's not about individuals choosing who they want to vote for. It's about a religious institution dictating those choices.
Right. It potentially overrides personal beliefs and political preferences.
And that raises some big questions about the role of religion in a democratic society. How much influence should religious institutions have on politics? Where do you draw the line between religious freedom and undue influence?
These are tough questions.
They are. And things get even more complicated when you start looking at some of the serious allegations against the INC.
Right. There have been some pretty disturbing accusations, particularly around a leadership crisis they had back in 2015.
Yeah, former members, including a minister named Lowell Menorca II, have accused the INC leadership of some pretty serious stuff. Corruption, kidnapping, even threats of violence against dissenters.
And Menorca's case is pretty well documented.
There was a whole documentary about it on the Fifth Estate.
Yeah, he claims he and his family were threatened, held against their will, and that he eventually had to flee the Philippines and seek asylum in Canada.
Based on religious persecution.
Right.
And his story isn't unique.
Not at all. Other former members have come forward with similar allegations.
So it's not just one disgruntled person?
No, it seems to point to a pattern of behavior.
An organization that's very protective of its power and willing to go to great lengths to silence anyone who challenges it.
That's the picture that's emerging from these accounts.
But the INC denies all of this right.
They do. They say these are false allegations spread by disgruntled former members.
And they point to their millions of members around the world.
Right, who remain loyal to the church.
So we've got these two very different narratives.
We do.
On one side, you've got the INC's official stance.
Denying any wrongdoing.
And on the other side, you've got the testimonies of former members.
Who claim to have experienced abuse and intimidation firsthand.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is.
And it really highlights the need for critical thinking. We can't just accept either narrative at face value.
Right, we need to look at all the evidence, the testimonies, the context.
And try to get a clear picture of what's going on.
Exactly.
Exactly.
It feels like we've only scratched the surface here. There's so much to unpack with cults and the INC and this whole intersection of religion and politics.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex landscape.
It is. And it's easy to get lost in all the details and accusations.
And the competing narratives.
Right. But I think it's important to step back for a second.
And think about what all of this means.
For the average person, for our listeners who've been digging into all this stuff, like, why should someone who's not directly affected by this even care?
Well, one of the big takeaways here, I think, is that this potential for manipulation and control, it exists in a lot of different contexts, not just in groups that we automatically think of as cults.
So it's not just about those stereotypical cults.
It's about understanding how groups can use these tactics to influence people, like the love bombing and isolation we were talking about, even appeals to fear and guilt.
It's all about recognizing those patterns.
And understanding how they can be used to exploit people. And those patterns can pop up anywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Even in groups that seem totally harmless at first.
Absolutely.
So that's why critical thinking is so important.
It really is.
It's about questioning what you're told, even if it's coming from someone you trust.
Yeah.
Or a group you belong to.
You always have to be willing to consider different perspectives.
And weigh the evidence for yourself.
Right, and make your own informed decisions.
It's easy to think, oh, that would never happen to me. I'm too smart to fall for that.
Right.
But these sources show just how sophisticated these tactics can be. and how even well-intentioned people can get pulled in.
Absolutely.
Sometimes those groups turn out to be really harmful.
Yeah, that's why it's so important to talk about these things
To raise awareness.
and give people the tools to spot those red flags.
And to remember that healthy organizations, whether it's a religious group, a social club, even a workplace, they should encourage open dialogue
Definitely.
and dissent.
People should feel comfortable speaking their minds.
Right. No one should be pressured to conform to beliefs they don't hold.
Or to participate in activities that make them uncomfortable.
Exactly. Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this has given you some things to think about.
Definitely.
We encourage you to keep exploring these issues. Do your own research and come to your own conclusions. We encourage you to keep exploring these issues. Do your own research and come to your own conclusions. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep thinking back to that question about where we draw the line between religious freedom and undue influence. It feels especially relevant when we're talking about groups like the INC, with their strong emphasis on obedience and unity.
Yeah. It's a tough one. Because on the one hand, you have the right to believe what you want and to practice your religion freely.
Right, that's a fundamental, right.
It is. But on the other hand, you also have the responsibility to make sure that those beliefs aren't being used to harm others.
Or to manipulate them.
Exactly.
And how do you strike that balance, especially when you're dealing with groups that have so much power and influence?
Right. It's a constant tension between individual autonomy and the authority of the group.
And I think that's a question we all have to grapple with.
Yeah.
Not just when we're talking about cults, but in all aspects of our lives.
Absolutely.
It's about being aware of those dynamics.
Yeah.
And making sure we're not giving up our own critical thinking or our own moral compass.
Right. In the name of obedience or loyalty.
Exactly. Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive. Thank you again for sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for sending your questions and sources. Keep them coming and keep those minds open. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.